I am Maya, 31 years old, and I run a top cybersecurity firm in Atlanta. But to my family, I am just the family failure who fixes computers for spare change. At my birthday dinner, my mother leaned over to my father and whispered that since everyone was occupied, they should have my brother go change the locks at my apartment. My brother quietly got up and left the restaurant. An hour later, he came back ghost white, his hands trembling as he whispered that someone was already inside. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The nightmare actually began exactly 1 hour before my brother returned looking like he had seen a ghost. We were sitting in a private dining room at the most exclusive steakhouse in Buckhead. The crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished mahogany tables, creating a perfect picture of upscale Atlanta success. My mother Vivian had insisted on this specific restaurant for my 31st birthday. She did not choose it to celebrate me. She chose it to show off to her upscale social club sisters who were dining at a nearby table. My brother Marcus sat across from me in a custom-tailored suit. He was playing the role of the perfect golden child, gearing up for his city council campaign. Next to him sat his wife Chloe. Chloe came from old money, a wealthy white family with a massive trust fund and a condescending smile that she reserved specifically for me. Chloe reached into her designer handbag and slid a small envelope across the crisp white tablecloth. She smiled her signature sympathetic smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes but looks great for an audience. "Happy birthday, Maya," she said, pitching her voice loudly enough for the waiter and the neighboring tables to hear. "I know things have been really tough for you lately. I loaded $50 onto this grocery store gift card. Since you are still just doing freelance computer repair work, I figured you could use some help buying food this week. It must be so hard struggling in this economy, especially when you do not have a real career to fall back on." I stared at the plastic card resting next to my wine glass. I did not fix computers for spare change. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a forensic accounting and cybersecurity firm that contracted with major federal banks. But my family refused to acknowledge my reality because it did not fit their carefully constructed narrative. To them, an independent unmarried woman building her own empire was a threat to the traditional image they wanted to project. My mother took a slow sip of her sparkling water and sighed heavily. She adjusted her expensive diamond necklace and gave me a look of pure disappointment. "Chloe is being incredibly generous to you, Maya," my mother said, her voice dripping with judgment. "You should be grateful she even thought of you. You are 31 years old, and you are still renting that rundown apartment your father had to co-sign for 5 years ago. It is completely humiliating for us to even talk about you to our friends." She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the table. "Marcus is launching his political campaign next month. He needs a spotless family image. How do you think it looks to the voters and our church congregation that his own sister is a jobless liability living in a terrible neighborhood? You are dragging down the family name. We have worked entirely too hard to build our reputation in this community just to have you ruin it by refusing to get a real job." Marcus adjusted his expensive watch and leaned back in his chair. He loved playing the wise and successful older brother, constantly looking down on me from his imaginary pedestal. "Come on, Mom, do not be too hard on her," Marcus said with a smirk that contradicted his supposed defense of me. "Not everyone is cut out for real success. Maya just lacks ambition. Maybe she can use that $50 gift card to buy some decent clothes for a real job interview. You know, something other than hoodies and jeans. I am sure my firm has an opening for a receptionist if she promises to show up on time." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply sat there watching them chew on their premium dry-aged steaks while they tried to chew up my self-esteem. My father Desmond, who had been quietly enjoying his prime rib, finally spoke up. He raised his hand and signaled the waiter to bring the check. The waiter hurried over, presenting a thick black leather folder. Without even glancing at the total, my father slid the folder directly across the large table. It glided over the polished wood and stopped right until it hit my dinner plate. The bill was for exactly $1,500. They had ordered top-tier steaks, expensive appetizers, and vintage imported wine, running up a massive tab for a birthday dinner they spent entirely insulting me. Pay this, Maya, my father demanded. His voice was hard, uncompromising, and loud enough to ensure there was no room for debate. It is time you learned some financial responsibility. Your brother has carried the weight of this family for far too long, and we are done subsidizing your failures. Consider this $1,500 bill a lesson in growing up. You need to understand what things actually cost in the real world. Pay the bill. Thank your sister-in-law for the groceries, and try to be more like your brother. I looked down at the massive bill, then up at the $50 grocery card Chloe had given me. The sheer audacity of demanding, I pay $1,500 right after publicly shaming me for supposedly being too broke to buy my own groceries was staggering. The entire table watched me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to beg them to cover the cost, waiting for me to accept my role as the pathetic scapegoat. But I did not panic. I reached into my purse, knowing exactly what I was about to do. I unclasped my designer handbag, reaching inside with slow, deliberate precision. The leather felt cool and familiar against my fingertips as I bypassed my standard bank cards and slid out a heavy piece of anodized titanium. I placed the American Express Centurion card directly on top of the black leather billfold my father had so aggressively pushed toward me. The sharp metallic clink of the heavy black card hitting the table cut right through the ambient noise of the restaurant, silencing the background jazz music playing through the overhead speakers. For a second, nobody breathed. My father, Desmond, stared at the card in confusion, his brow furrowed as he tried to process why my credit card looked like a solid piece of metal. But my sister-in-law, Chloe, knew exactly what it was. Coming from old money and a family that measured human worth by bank account balances, she recognized the ultimate status symbol immediately. Chloe dropped her silver fork, sending a piece of filet mignon tumbling onto her pristine porcelain plate. Her pale face flushed a deep shade of crimson as her eyes locked onto the card. "That is an Amex Centurion," Chloe whispered, her voice stripped of its usual condescending lilt. "Those are by invitation only. You have to spend at least $500,000 a year just to keep the account active." The words $500,000 echoed around our private dining room. My father froze. Marcus stopped chewing his steak, and my mother Vivian completely lost her mind. Vivian did not express pride. She did not apologize for her earlier insults. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of absolute horror. She slammed both of her hands flat against the mahogany table, rattling the crystal wine glasses and leaning aggressively across the floral centerpieces. "Where did you steal that?" Vivian hissed. Her eyes darted frantically around the upscale restaurant, as if she expected federal agents to swarm our table at any second. "Who did you steal that from, Maya? Tell me the truth right now." I leaned back in my plush leather chair and picked up my glass of vintage red wine, taking a slow, appreciative sip. "I stole it from no one, Mother. It has my name engraved right on the front. Feel free to inspect it if you do not believe me." Vivian shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair trembling with her rage. "You are lying. You fix broken laptops in a rundown apartment. Women like you do not carry black cards unless they are committing major fraud or sleeping with dangerous drug dealers." She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice rising to a frantic, embarrassing pitch that made diners at nearby tables turn our way. "I know exactly what you are doing. You are running some sort of illegal scam. You always were too lazy to do things the right way, always looking for a shortcut." Vivian frantically grabbed my father by the arm, her immaculate fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "Desmond, you have to do something. If she gets indicted for federal financial crimes, the local press will have an absolute field day. It will completely ruin the city council campaign for Marcus. We cannot have a convicted criminal in the family while he is running for public office. The congregation at our church will tear us apart. We have worked our entire lives to be respected Black professionals in Atlanta, and she is going to destroy our legacy by acting like a street thug." Chloe quickly recovered from her initial shock, her deeply ingrained prejudice surfacing as she eagerly jumped on my mother's bandwagon. "It makes perfect sense," Vivian, Chloe said, swirling her martini with a cruel smirk. "I read a news article about this recently. There is a massive credit card fraud ring operating out of those low-income neighborhoods in South Atlanta. It is a very common hustle for people who cannot hold down a legitimate corporate job. Honestly, Maya, I thought you were just financially struggling, but running a scam from the hood, that is just pathetic. Even for you. You are going to drag my husband's good name through the mud because you wanted to play pretend with a stolen credit card. I looked at my white sister-in-law, feeling an icy calm smile form on my lips. You read an article. That is fascinating. Did your little article happen to mention that the minimum initiation fee for this specific card is $10,000 in cash, and it requires rigorous background checks and financial audits by the bank before they even send the invitation? Tell me, what kind of street-level scammer pays an initiation fee like that just for the privilege of carrying a piece of titanium? Before Chloe could sputter out a defensive response, the general manager of the steakhouse hurried over to our table. He was a distinguished older man in a pristine tuxedo, followed closely by a waiter carrying a silver ice bucket. The manager completely ignored my father, who was technically the host of the dinner. He bypassed Marcus and Chloe without a single glance. He stopped right next to my chair and offered a deep, incredibly respectful bow. "Good evening, Madam Chief Executive," the manager said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent table. "I was just informed by my front-of-house staff that you are dining with us tonight. It is an absolute honor to have you back at our establishment. I have already applied your usual VIP corporate status to the bill, but frankly, your money is no good here tonight." The manager signaled the waiter, who smoothly placed a chilled bottle of incredibly expensive champagne on the table. "The owner insists this entire meal is completely on the house to thank you for upgrading our corporate cybersecurity servers last month. We have not had a single data breach or payment system failure since your firm took over our network. Your team is brilliant. Please enjoy the champagne with our deepest compliments." My father stared at the manager, his mouth hanging slightly open. Madam Chief Executive Desmond echoed the words, sounding completely foreign and bitter on his tongue. "What are you talking about? My daughter is a freelance tech support worker. She fixes broken computers." The manager looked genuinely confused for a moment, glancing between my father's bewildered face and my calm, steady smile. "Sir, this is Maya. She owns and operates the largest digital forensics and cybersecurity firm in the state of Georgia. She personally handles the security infrastructure for half the high-end hospitality groups and major financial institutions in Atlanta. She is one of our most valued corporate partners." The silence that slammed down on our table was absolute. Vivian looked like she had just been physically struck. Chloe stared at the bottle of complimentary champagne as if it were highly toxic. But it was Marcus who had the most extreme reaction. The blood rapidly drained from my brother's face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He had been unusually quiet during this entire exchange, clutching his linen napkin with white knuckles. Marcus was a senior portfolio manager at a major investment bank in the city. Hearing the words digital forensics and cybersecurity firm hit him harder than anyone else at the table. A sudden sharp realization flashed in his panicked eyes. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic. He knew exactly what my company did because his bank had recently contracted a highly secretive independent firm to investigate a massive internal financial discrepancy involving millions of missing dollars. He had been sweating over this upcoming audit for weeks. He just never realized that the ruthless cybersecurity firm tracking down the stolen money belonged to his little sister. Marcus abruptly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly and violently against the hardwood floor, causing several heads in the restaurant to turn. "I need to take a call," he said, his voice incredibly tight and pitched an octave too high. "It is a campaign donor. It is very urgent. I have to step outside." He did not wait for Vivian to praise his political dedication. He did not wait for Chloe to ask who exactly was calling in the middle of a birthday dinner. He practically sprinted out of the private dining room, clutching his phone like a lifeline, leaving his expensive dry-aged steak completely untouched. He was not taking a phone call from a political donor. He was suffocating in pure panic. And as I watched him rush through the restaurant exit, I knew exactly where he was heading. I was heading straight to my apartment to destroy the servers he thought I kept there. As the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind my brother, the private dining room descended into a thick, suffocating tension. The general manager bowed respectfully one last time and quietly exited, leaving the complimentary bottle of champagne chilling on the table. My mother Vivian was breathing heavily. Her chest heaved beneath her silk designer dress, her eyes darting between the solid titanium credit card on the table and my perfectly calm face. She was a woman who had spent her entire life meticulously curating an image of upper-class perfection for our community and our church. She could not comprehend that the daughter she had designated as the family failure was sitting across from her holding more financial power than her entire social circle combined. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a fraction of maternal pride, Vivian did what she always did when she lost control. She resorted to underhanded manipulation. She leaned close to my father, her hand gripping his tailored sleeve. She lowered her voice to a harsh, frantic whisper, thinking the ambient jazz music would mask her words. "Since Marcus is already outside," Vivian hissed into my father's ear, "text him right now. Tell him to go straight to her apartment and meet the locksmith. We need those locks changed tonight while she is stuck here with us. We will throw her junk in the hallway." I set my wine glass down. The sharp clink of the crystal against the table made both of my parents jump. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes. "Change the locks," I repeated, keeping my voice steady and dangerously quiet. "You are planning to change the locks on my apartment on the night of my 31st birthday." My father Desmond shifted uncomfortably in his seat, refusing to meet my gaze. He adjusted his tie, trying to summon the patriarchal authority he had used to bully me for decades. "It is my name on the original lease, Maya," Desmond said, clearing his throat. "I co-signed for that place 5 years ago. Legally, I have the right to secure the property. You have become entirely too unpredictable, carrying around suspicious credit cards, making up wild stories about owning companies. Your mother and I agree that you need some tough love to force you into reality. We are terminating your lease effective immediately." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. He was completely willing to render his own daughter homeless in the middle of the night, just to punish me for stepping out of the pathetic role they had assigned to me. But before I could dissect his terrible excuse, my sister-in-law decided to insert her privileged opinion into the conversation. Chloe took a delicate sip of her martini and sighed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Honestly, Maya, you are making a massive deal out of nothing," Chloe said. Her tone was dripping with that specific brand of casual entitlement she had perfected growing up in a wealthy old money household. "My cousin Savannah is moving to Atlanta next week to start her art residency. She needs a starter apartment in a trendy neighborhood. Your parents were generous enough to offer your place to my family, since you are clearly too unstable to maintain it. Savannah is willing to pay the rent, and it saves your father the embarrassment of having his name tied to whatever illegal activities you are running out of that dump." I looked from Chloe to my parents, putting the pieces together. The sheer scale of their betrayal was breathtaking. They were not just kicking me out to punish me. They were rendering me homeless to suck up to Chloe and her wealthy white family. Vivian and Desmond were so desperate to maintain their proximity to Chloe's generational wealth and secure her family's political donations for Marcus that they were literally offering up my home as a sacrifice. They wanted to hand my apartment over to a privileged 20-something art student just to score points with the in-laws. "You are throwing me out on the street to impress Chloe's family," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a physical blade. "You are tossing your own flesh and blood onto the pavement to act like a generous landlord for a girl you have never even met. It is about family legacy." Maya, my mother, snapped, slamming her hand on the table again. "Chloe's family has invested heavily in the political campaign for Marcus. They are helping us elevate our standing in this city. We all have to make sacrifices to support your brother. He is the future of this family. You are just being selfish as usual." A dark, humorless laugh escaped my lips. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, fixing my mother with a stare that made her physically recoil. "Sacrifices," I whispered, letting the word hang in the cold air. "You want to talk to me about sacrifices for the golden child? Does Chloe know about the first sacrifice you forced me to make for Marcus? Or did you conveniently leave that chapter out of his perfect political biography?" My father's face instantly drained of color. "Keep your mouth shut," Maya, Desmond warned, his voice dropping to a panicked growl. "Do not bring up the past. This is family business." Chloe frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together. What is she talking about? Chloe asked, looking between my terrified parents. What sacrifice? I did not break eye contact with my mother as I answered my sister-in-law. I am talking about my college tuition, Chloe. When I was 18 years old, I got accepted into a top-tier university. My grandmother had left a trust fund specifically for my education. $100,000. I studied late every single night, earned perfect grades, and did everything right to make this family proud. But when I went to the bank to pay my first semester tuition, the account was empty. Maya, stop it right now, my mother practically shrieked. She reached across the table, trying to grab my wrist, but I swiftly pulled my hand away. They drained it. I continued, my voice growing louder, forcing them to hear the truth they had buried for over a decade. Every single penny of my grandmother's money was gone. And do you know why, Chloe? Because your perfect husband, the brilliant Ivy League scholar, the future city councilman, had developed a massive underground sports betting addiction during his sophomore year at his elite university. Marcus owed $100,000 to some very dangerous people who were threatening to break his legs. So my parents stole my future to pay off his gambling debts. They sacrificed my education to save his reputation. Chloe turned completely white. She slowly set her martini glass down, her hands shaking slightly. Marcus had a gambling addiction, Chloe asked, her voice tight with rising horror. He owed money to bookies. He told my father his background was spotless. He told my family he had never been in any kind of legal or financial trouble. My parents were in full panic mode. Vivian was hyperventilating, desperately trying to do damage control in front of the woman who represented their ticket to high society. Chloe, sweetie, please do not listen to her, Vivian begged, reaching out toward her daughter-in-law. It was a minor misunderstanding when he was a foolish college student. We handled it privately. Maya is just bringing it up now out of pure spite because she is jealous of your beautiful marriage. Jealous? I asked, standing up from my chair. I towered over them, radiating a quiet, absolute authority that finally made my parents shrink back in their seats. I spent the last decade working 3 jobs, sleeping on dirty couches, and eating ramen noodles to build my life back from the ashes you left me in. You threw me away to save a lying addict. You treated me like dirt to protect his golden image. And tonight, you sat here and tried to humiliate me over a dinner bill while plotting to steal my home. You do not get to call me jealous. You do not get to call me a failure. And you certainly do not get to control me ever again. Vivian jumped to her feet, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and pure venom. You listen to me. Me, you ungrateful little brat, my mother screamed, no longer caring who heard her. I do not care what kind of fake metal credit card you show off. I am calling the police right now. I am telling them you are running a fraudulent business out of the apartment we co-signed for. We will have you arrested and thrown in a cell before you can ruin your brother's life. She dug frantically into her designer purse, pulling out her smartphone with trembling hands. She was actually going to do it. She was going to call the authorities on her own daughter to protect her son's political campaign based on absolute delusions. But before Vivian could dial a single digit, the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room burst open with a violent, echoing crash. Everyone jumped. My mother dropped her phone. Chloe gasped and pressed her hand to her chest. Marcus stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant executive who had been mocking me an hour earlier. His custom-tailored suit jacket was completely ruined, drenched in sweat and clinging to his shoulders. His expensive silk tie was torn open. His eyes were bloodshot and wide with an absolute primal terror. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted for miles. Marcus stumbled into the room, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet. He grabbed the back of an empty chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He looked directly at my mother, his face the color of wet ash. Mom. Marcus gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. Mom, there are people in her apartment. Men in black suits. They have guns. The absolute silence that had settled over the private dining room was shattered instantly by my mother's piercing scream. Vivian did not rush to comfort her son. She did not ask Marcus if he was hurt, if he needed a glass of water, or if he required medical attention. Instead, she spun around, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged fury, and leveled a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. What kind of dangerous criminals are you harboring? Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the dark mahogany walls of the upscale dining room. Men with guns. In an apartment we co-signed for. You are running some kind of violent cartel operation out of that dump, aren't you? She began pacing frantically back and forth across the plush carpet, her expensive silk dress rustling loudly with every agitated step. She muttered rapidly about the police, the local news anchors, and the absolute irreversible destruction of our family name. In her twisted mind, a successful independent black woman simply could not exist without some dark illegal underworld propping her up. She was entirely convinced I was laundering dirty money for a dangerous drug syndicate. She was already picturing the scandalous newspaper headlines, terrified that my supposed criminal empire would obliterate Marcus and his pristine political campaign before it even officially started. Chloe physically backed away from the dining table, pulling her expensive designer clutch tight against her chest, as if she might catch a deadly disease just by breathing the same air as me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. I knew it, Chloe said, her voice dripping with that quiet, lethal brand of prejudice she usually reserved for country club dinners when she thought no one else was listening. I told you, Vivian. People like her always bring the chaos and violence of the hood right to your doorstep. You try to pull them out of the gutter, you try to give them a respectable place to live, but they just drag their criminal baggage straight into our lives. We could all be in extreme danger right now because your sister-in-law decided to play gangster with a stolen credit card. I did not raise my voice. I did not jump out of my chair to defend my character or beg them to listen to reason. I simply picked up my crystal glass of vintage red wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I watched the absolute circus unfolding in front of me. The rich burgundy liquid slid smoothly down my throat, grounding me in the reality that I was the only person in this room who actually held any real power. I set the glass down. The soft, elegant clink of the crystal against the table drew their attention for a fraction of a second. But my eyes were not on my frantic mother or my highly prejudiced sister-in-law. My focus was entirely locked on Marcus. My golden child brother was leaning heavily against a dining chair, gasping for air, as if he had just run a marathon. Sweat poured down his forehead in thick droplets, completely soaking the stiff white collar of his custom-tailored dress shirt. His hands were shaking so violently that they rattled the solid wooden backrest of the chair he was desperately clinging to for support. This was not the reaction of a man who had merely peeked through a keyhole and spotted a potential threat in the hallway. This was the visceral, primal terror of a man who had just walked blindly into a devastating trap and barely escaped with his freedom. Marcus, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hysterical rambling of my mother and the disgusted sighs of Chloe. The calm, icy authority in my tone forced the room into a sudden, incredibly tense silence. Look at me. Marcus flinched hard. He slowly raised his head, his bloodshot eyes meeting mine with profound reluctance. He looked absolutely terrified, a cornered animal realizing the walls were rapidly closing in on him. You told Mom and Dad you were just going to meet the locksmith, I stated, speaking very slowly, so every single syllable would land with maximum devastating impact. You said you were just going to change the locks on the front door to throw me out on the street. But my apartment has a solid steel door, Marcus. There are no windows facing the exterior hallway. There is absolutely no way to see inside from the corridor. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, keeping my intense gaze pinned directly to his sweating, panicked face. So tell me, Marcus, how exactly did you know they were wearing black suits? How did you know they had guns? The remaining blood drained completely from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some clever lie, but only a dry, choking sound managed to escape his throat. The only way you could have seen those men, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, knowing whisper, is if you bypassed the front door entirely. The only way you could have seen them is if you used the unauthorized spare key you stole from Mom. You did not stay in the hallway, you went inside. You walked past the small living room down the long hall, and you opened the locked door to my secure computer room. You went looking for my servers, did you not? The silence in the private dining room was heavy and absolute. Chloe frowned deeply, looking back and forth between me and her trembling husband, clearly failing to understand why Marcus was looking at me with pure, unadulterated dread instead of his usual righteous anger. Vivian completely stopped her frantic pacing. She stared at her favorite son, waiting for him to snap back at me, waiting for him to put me in my place and explain away my logical deduction with one of his smooth corporate excuses. But Marcus could not speak. He was actively hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as he realized that I knew exactly what he had tried to do. He had gone there to plant false digital evidence of his own massive embezzlement scheme onto my servers. He had gone there to frame his own younger sister for a federal financial crime to save his political and professional career. And he had walked straight into a room full of highly trained armed federal agents. "I was just checking the property," Marcus finally stammered out, his voice cracking pitifully as he tried to defend himself. He took a stumbling step backward, wiping the heavy sweat from his face with a trembling hand. "I just wanted to make sure the apartment was secure. I had a bad feeling when I arrived. I was just trying to protect the family asset." He looked desperately toward my father, silently begging the patriarch of the family to step in and save him from my relentless interrogation. Desmond, who had remained rigidly silent with his arms crossed during this entire exchange, finally erupted. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the dining table with such explosive force that the silver cutlery rattled loudly against the fine porcelain plates. Desmond's face was twisted into an ugly, aggressive scowl, his patriarchal pride deeply wounded by my sheer insubordination and my calm refusal to act like the frightened dependent victim they desperately needed me to be. "Enough of this absolute nonsense," Desmond roared, pointing a massive accusing finger directly at my face. "Your brother is standing here shaking in terror because of the violent thugs you invited into a property that I personally co-signed for. You are twisting his words to cover up your own filthy criminal lifestyle. I will not stand here and listen to you interrogate my successful son while armed gangsters are currently tearing apart a home with my good name on the lease." Desmond turned away from me, addressing the rest of the table with his voice booming with unquestionable, arrogant authority. "Get your coats right now," he commanded sharply. "We are leaving this restaurant immediately. We are all driving to that apartment together. I am going to march right up to that front door. I am going to call the Atlanta Police Department, and I am going to have them drag every single one of those criminals out into the street in handcuffs. And then, Maya, I am going to personally throw every piece of garbage you own onto the sidewalk tonight." The valet at the steakhouse brought my father's pristine black Cadillac Escalade to the curb in record time. Desmond marched out of the restaurant like a general leading his troops into battle, his face set in a mask of righteous fury. He practically shoved Marcus into the middle row of seats, treating his golden boy rougher than usual, clearly agitated by the public embarrassment. Chloe slid in next to her husband, pulling her expensive designer coat tightly around her shoulders, as if trying to physically shield herself from the impending ghetto drama she was so certain I had caused. Vivian took the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she aggressively snapped her seatbelt into place. I took my time. I smoothed the skirt of my dress, tipped the valet a crisp $50 bill, and gracefully climbed into the third row of the spacious vehicle. The heavy doors of the SUV slammed shut, sealing us inside a rolling pressure cooker of hostility and prejudice. Desmond slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing away from the valet stand with a harsh screech of tires. The luxury vehicle sped down the neon-lit streets of Buckhead, but the smooth ride did nothing to dampen the violent outburst erupting from the driver's seat. My father gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned a pale shade of gray. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes blazing with a judgmental fire that I had endured my entire life. "You have crossed the final line tonight, Maya," Desmond roared, his deep voice vibrating through the cabin of the vehicle. "I am a senior deacon at one of the largest and most respected churches in Atlanta. I sit on the executive board. I shake hands with the mayor. I have spent 30 years building a reputation as an upstanding, God-fearing man in this community. And now you bring armed thugs and federal agents into a property associated with my name. I swear to you, the minute we handle this mess and throw your garbage onto the street, I am going before the entire church council. I will personally denounce you. I will stand at the pulpit and tell the congregation that I no longer have a daughter. You will be completely cut off. No one in our network will ever speak to you again. Vivian twisted around in her leather seat to glare at me, her flawless makeup doing nothing to hide the ugly sneer on her face. Her primary concern, as always, was not my safety or my well-being. It was her fragile social status. Desmond is right, Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and grating against the quiet hum of the engine. Do you have any idea what the local news stations will do with a story like this? They are going to run a prime-time special about a drug raid or a fraud ring connected to our family. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution will plaster your mugshot right next to the campaign announcement for Marcus. My sorority sisters are already looking for any excuse to challenge my position on the charity gala committee. If the police march you out of an apartment in handcuffs, we will be a laughingstock. You are a disgrace to every single sacrifice we made to elevate this family out of the struggle. I sat back in the third row, resting my hands peacefully in my lap, letting their venom wash over me without leaving a single scratch. But the true masterpiece of prejudice was happening right in front of me in the middle row. Chloe was violently tapping away on the glowing screen of her smartphone. The blue light illuminated her pale, panicked face. She was not just scared. She was deeply, profoundly offended that her proximity to our Black family was suddenly threatening her pristine, old money white pedigree. I am texting my father's primary legal counsel right now, Chloe announced loudly, making sure every single syllable carried the weight of her generational wealth. I am having his wealth management lawyers draft an immediate statement of separation. My family has spent a century building our philanthropic legacy. I refuse to let my maiden name be dragged through the mud because my sister-in-law decided to associate with violent street criminals. We will legally separate Marcus from this entire disaster by morning. I told you this would happen, Vivian. I told you that no matter how much money you throw at people like her, they always revert to their true nature. You cannot buy class, and you certainly cannot fix ghetto behavior. Her blatant, racially coded insults hung heavy in the air, but neither of my parents dared to correct her. They were too terrified of losing her family's political donations to defend their own flesh and blood. They simply let her hurl her toxic microaggressions right into the back seat. Beside her, Marcus sat completely frozen. He was staring blankly out the tinted window, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He did not agree with his wife. He did not defend me. He simply existed in a state of pure, paralyzing terror. He knew I was not running a street gang. He knew exactly what those men in black suits were doing in my computer room because he had walked right into the digital snare I had laid out specifically for him. While the three of them competed to see who could hurl the most vicious insult at me, I quietly reached into my designer bag and pulled out my smartphone. The screen unlocked with a quick facial scan, bringing up my highly encrypted proprietary messaging application. I did not need to type out a long, desperate plea for help. I did not need to call a lawyer. I simply opened the direct communication channel to the lead federal agent currently standing inside my pristine penthouse. I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips that vanished into the shadows of the third row. I tapped the digital keyboard with calm, absolute certainty, typing out a single definitive command. Pull the net. I hit send. The message, encrypted, bounced through 3 secure servers and delivered my final verdict. The trap was officially closed. There was no backing out now. Marcus was going to face the full devastating weight of the federal government, and my parents were going to have front-row seats to the destruction of their false idol. Desmond had been driving blindly in his rage, following the frantic GPS directions Marcus had mumbled out before we left the restaurant. My father had naturally assumed we were heading toward the run-down, low-income suburban apartment complex where he had co-signed my lease 5 years ago. He was so blinded by his own anger and assumptions that he had not even bothered to look at the street signs. He just assumed we were driving into the slums. But as the Escalade cruised smoothly down the immaculate tree-lined avenues, the scenery did not devolve into broken streetlights and graffiti. Instead, we were driving deeper into the most exclusive, hyper-wealthy district in the entire city of Atlanta. The streets were lined with designer boutiques, luxury car dealerships, and Michelin star restaurants. Desmond abruptly slammed on the brakes, causing the heavy SUV to jerk violently. Vivian let out a startled gasp, grabbing the dashboard to steady herself. Chloe dropped her phone onto the floorboard. Marcus just squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could disappear. My father looked out the front windshield, his mouth opening and closing in absolute bewildered silence. We were not parked outside a dilapidated apartment building in a sketchy neighborhood. We were pulled up directly to the grand glowing entrance of the Sovereign. It was a towering architectural masterpiece of a skyscraper, universally known as the most expensive, heavily guarded, and ultra-luxurious residential building in the state. The driveway was paved with imported stone. A line of exotic sports cars sat parked near the entrance, flanked by multiple doormen in immaculate tailored uniforms and a dedicated, highly visible private security team. "This cannot be right," Desmond muttered, staring up at the gleaming glass tower that seemed to touch the night sky. He looked down at the GPS screen on the dashboard, then back up at the towering symbol of extreme wealth. "The navigation says we have arrived, but this is the Sovereign. Minimum buy-in here is $5 million. The security alone costs more than my yearly salary." Vivian pressed her face against the passenger window, her eyes wide with total confusion. "Why did the GPS bring us here?" she demanded, her voice losing its aggressive edge, replaced entirely by profound disorientation. "Maya, what kind of sick game are you playing? Why did you give Marcus this address?" Chloe scoffed from the middle row, leaning forward to look out the window. "It is obvious, Vivian. She gave Marcus a fake address to buy herself time. She probably has her little street gang cleaning out her real apartment right now, so the cops cannot find her stash. She is just wasting our time." I sat back in the deep leather seat of the third row, watching the valet attendants in their crisp uniforms begin to approach our vehicle. I reached for the door handle, feeling the cool chrome beneath my fingers. "I did not give him a fake address, Chloe," I said softly, letting my voice carry forward to the front of the cabin. I opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the pristine imported stone driveway, letting the cool night air wash over me. I looked back inside the vehicle at the four people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "Get out of the car," I instructed them, my tone shifting from a daughter enduring a lecture to a chief executive giving an absolute command. "You wanted to see where I live. You wanted to meet the men in the black suits. So step out of the vehicle and let me welcome you to my world." I stepped out of the heavy luxury vehicle, and my designer heels met the immaculate imported stone of the driveway. The crisp night air of upscale Atlanta brushed against my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating toxicity I had just endured inside my father's car. I did not wait for the rest of them. I simply turned my back and began walking gracefully toward the towering glass entrance of the Sovereign. Behind me, the absolute chaos of my family spilled out onto the pristine sidewalk. Desmond was furiously barking orders at a valet attendant who had dared to approach his vehicle, his patriarchal ego completely bruised by the unexpected change in location. Vivian stumbled out of the passenger side, her silk dress catching the cold breeze as she frantically scanned the billionaire playground we had just parked in. Chloe slammed the car door with entirely too much force. She practically stomped across the driveway, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. "What the hell are you doing at a building like this?" "Maya," Chloe shouted, her voice echoing loudly and drawing the irritated glances of several wealthy residents exiting a nearby Maybach. "Are you completely insane? This is the Sovereign. My father has major corporate investors who own properties in this tower. You do not bring your ghetto family drama to an address like this, just to stall for time. I know exactly what you are doing. You gave Marcus a fake address so your little street gang could scrub your real apartment clean before the police arrive. You are wasting our time and embarrassing us in public." I kept walking, my pace steady and unbothered. The massive revolving glass doors were just a few feet away. Vivian hurried to catch up with me, her high heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She reached out, attempting to grab my arm and physically drag me back to the car. "Do not take another step toward that entrance," Vivian hissed, her eyes wide with a terrifying mix of anger and social panic. "The private security here will arrest you for trespassing the second you cross the threshold. You are going to end up handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, and your mugshot will destroy the political campaign for Marcus. Turn around right now and give your father the real address to your dump of an apartment." I smoothly sidestepped my mother's grasping hand without breaking my stride. I did not even look at her. I simply walked directly toward the two heavily armed, broad-shouldered private security contractors stationed outside the main glass doors. Vivian gasped, fully expecting the guards to tackle me to the ground. Chloe crossed her arms with a smug, vindictive smile, waiting to watch me be humiliated by the white establishment she worshipped. But the guards did not draw their weapons. They did not shout a warning. The moment they saw my face, both men immediately stepped back, pulled the heavy glass doors wide open, and snapped into rigid attention. "Good evening, ma'am, the guard on the right said, bowing his head respectfully. "Welcome back." I stepped onto the breathtaking Italian marble floor of the grand lobby. The space was a masterpiece of modern luxury, featuring a massive cascading waterfall wall, towering crystal light fixtures, and original abstract art that cost more than my parents had earned in their entire lifetimes. Desmond, Vivian, Chloe, and a thoroughly terrified Marcus trailed a few steps behind me, their mouths hanging open as they crossed the threshold. They were entirely disoriented, their brains short-circuiting, as they tried to comprehend why the high-end security team had treated me like royalty instead of a threat. Before my father could demand an explanation, a distinguished white man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit rushed across the vast expanse of the lobby. He was the general manager of the building, a man known for his ruthless exclusivity and elite clientele management. He completely bypassed my wealthy-looking father and my old-money sister-in-law. He stopped directly in front of me, placing his right hand over his heart in a gesture of profound professional reverence. "Good evening, Madam Chairman," the manager said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity across the quiet lobby. "We were not expecting you back from your birthday dinner so soon. I hope the evening has been to your exact specifications. Do you require me to have the concierge team arrange anything for your guests tonight?" Desmond froze dead in his tracks. Vivian looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth to muffle a shocked gasp. But it was Chloe who completely lost her mind. Her deeply ingrained racial prejudice and classist arrogance flared up in an ugly, desperate display of denial. "Excuse me," Chloe snapped, marching right up to the general manager and pointing an aggressive finger in his direction. "There is clearly a massive administrative mistake happening here. You have confused my sister-in-law with someone else entirely. She does not belong in a building like this. She fixes broken computers for minimum wage and rents a low-income apartment in South Atlanta. I demand to know who you think she is, because I promise you, she is running a scam on your entire security team." The general manager slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. The warmth and respect instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating professional disdain. He looked at her as if she were a piece of trash that had somehow blown into his pristine lobby. He did not answer her right away. Instead, he looked to me silently, asking for my permission to put this disrespectful woman in her proper place. I gave him a single subtle nod. "Madam," the manager said, addressing Chloe with a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is Maya. She is the founder and chief executive officer of the premier cybersecurity firm that secures the digital infrastructure of this entire facility. Furthermore, through her private equity holding group, she personally holds the majority ownership stake of this entire residential tower. She is not running a scam. She is quite literally my boss, and she owns the very floor you are currently standing on." Chloe physically recoiled as if she had been slapped across the face. Her pale skin turned a sickly shade of green. She looked at me, then at the manager, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Her entire worldview, a world where she was the wealthy white savior, gracing a struggling black family with her presence, had just been completely pulverized. Desmond stepped forward, shaking his head in aggressive, desperate denial. He refused to let go of the narrative that gave him power over me. "No," Desmond barked, his voice echoing loudly. "That is absolutely impossible. I co-signed a lease for her in a cheap apartment complex 5 years ago. I saw the paperwork. That is her registered address. That is exactly where Marcus went tonight to change the locks. You are covering for her." I slowly turned to face my father. The high vaulted ceilings of the lobby made me look taller, more imposing. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and I was finally ready to drop the crushing weight of the truth right onto their arrogant shoulders. "You co-signed a lease 5 years ago, Desmond," I said, dropping the title of father forever. "I paid off the entire balance of that lease and handed those keys back to the landlord 4 years ago. I never lived there a day longer than I had to." Vivian looked frantic. Then why did you keep using that address? Why is it on your tax forms? Why is it on your mail? Because I needed a decoy. I stated, my voice echoing with a lethal, absolute calm. I kept that address active on public records and basic family correspondence for one very specific reason. I needed a blind spot. I knew that I was surrounded by toxic, manipulative people who constantly tried to monitor my life, who actively prayed for my downfall, and who would not hesitate to sabotage my success if they knew how much power I actually held. People exactly like you. And people exactly like your golden boy standing right over there. I raised my hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at Marcus. He was pressing his back against a marble pillar, sweating profusely, looking like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. Marcus did not go to a rundown apartment tonight to change the locks. I continued, ensuring every word pierced through the silence of the lobby. He went to a highly monitored, digitally isolated dummy address that I set up specifically to catch corporate spies and financial criminals. He thought he was walking into my vulnerable home to destroy my life. Instead, he walked right into a digital honeypot, and he triggered the trap the second he opened that door. I looked at my parents, watching their false empire of superiority crumble into dust right before my eyes. "Welcome to the building where I actually live," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "Now, if you still want to see those men in black suits who terrified Marcus so badly, I suggest you follow me to my private elevator. But I guarantee you Marcus does not want to go up to the penthouse." Chloe's face morphed from shock into an ugly mask of desperate denial. She shook her head so violently that her perfectly styled blonde hair whipped across her shoulders. "There is absolutely no way," Chloe shrieked, her voice bouncing off the imported marble pillars of the lobby. "You do not just buy a penthouse in the Sovereign by fixing computers. You are a front. That is exactly what this is. You are a money-laundering puppet for some illegal syndicate. My family has been in commercial real estate for generations. We know how these things work. People like you do not acquire this level of equity overnight without dirty money backing every single cent." My father stepped forward, emboldened by Chloe and her ridiculous accusations. He completely ignored the towering general manager who was still standing at attention beside me. Desmond puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the patriarchal authority that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. "I do not care what kind of fraudulent paperwork you filed to get your name on this building, Maya," he barked. "Marcus told us exactly what he saw. I saw dangerous men in dark suits carrying weapons inside your property. You are harboring armed fugitives, and you are putting this entire family at risk. Take us up there right now. I am going to see exactly what kind of criminal enterprise you are running, and then I am handing you over to the authorities myself. I will not let you drag your brother down into the gutter with you." I did not argue. I did not defend my legitimate wealth against a woman who inherited every dollar she owned, or a father who worshipped a son that was currently sweating through his designer suit. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the private gold-trimmed elevator reserved exclusively for the penthouse owners. "If you are so eager to meet the armed men," Marcus saw, I said, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow calm, "then follow me. But I highly suggest you prepare yourselves. The truth is rarely as neat as the lies you prefer to believe." The walk to the private elevator felt like a funeral march. Vivian clutched her expensive handbag to her chest like a shield, muttering frantic prayers under her breath. Chloe trailed behind her, aggressively tapping on her smartphone screen, desperately trying to contact her wealthy father to distance herself from what she assumed would be a massive drug bust. But Marcus was the one who looked truly terrifying. He was dragging his feet, his breath hitching in his throat with every step. He looked like a man walking straight toward an executioner block. I swiped my heavy titanium keycard against the biometric scanner panel next to the elevator. A soft chime rang out, and the thick mahogany doors slid open seamlessly. I stepped inside the spacious mirrored cab. My family hesitated for a fraction of a second before piling in after me. The doors closed, sealing us inside a claustrophobic box of hostility. I pressed the single illuminated button at the very top of the panel. Penthouse. The high-speed elevator shot upward. The digital floor indicator ticked higher and higher, 30, 40, 50, racing toward the peak of the Atlanta skyline. The tension inside that small space was thick enough to choke on. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the machinery and the erratic, desperate wheezing coming from Marcus. He was staring at the floor indicator as if it were a countdown to his own death. He knew he had not seen gang members. I knew he had seen something far worse for a corporate criminal. When the digital display flashed 65, the elevator slowed. A soft melodic ding signaled our arrival. The heavy mahogany doors slid apart, and the scent of ozone and sterile electronics immediately washed over us. "Step out," I commanded softly. My parents and Chloe practically shoved their way out of the elevator, fully expecting to walk into a smoky, dangerous trap house filled with illicit drugs and violent street thugs. Instead, they stepped directly into the massive two-story foyer of a breathtaking luxury penthouse. But the space had not been decorated for entertaining guests. It had been entirely converted into a state-of-the-art military-grade cybersecurity command center. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta night sky, but the glass was obscured by towering rows of high-capacity server racks humming with intense power. Massive holographic monitors were mounted along the pristine white walls, displaying cascading lines of encrypted code, global financial heat maps, and real-time data tracking systems. There were no drugs. There were no street thugs. There was only raw, intimidating, undisputed technological dominance. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, her jaw dropping as she took in the tens of millions of dollars worth of forensic hardware surrounding her. Desmond blinked rapidly, completely unable to process the scale of the operation. But Vivian did not care about the computers. Her eyes were locked on the far end of the expansive room, where over a dozen broad-shouldered men were gathered around a central conference table. Marcus had been right about one thing. They were indeed wearing dark suits and they were heavily armed. But they were not cartel enforcers. Over their crisp white shirts they wore heavy tactical vests emblazoned with bold bright yellow letters, FBI. Scattered among the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents were several men and women wearing jackets that read IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They were poring over digital ledgers, speaking into headsets, and coordinating with a quiet, lethal efficiency. This was a joint federal task force, and they had turned my living room into their temporary operational headquarters. The sheer authority radiating from the federal agents was staggering. At the center of the group stood Agent Reynolds, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and piercing blue eyes. He was the head of the Financial Crimes Division. When he heard the soft chime of the elevator doors opening, he paused his conversation and turned his head. His sharp gaze swept past my trembling brother, ignored my bewildered father, and locked directly onto me. Agent Reynolds straightened his posture and took a deliberate step forward, his expression grave and professional. For one brief, chaotic second, Vivian completely misunderstood the entire situation. Blinded by her lifelong determination to see me fail, poisoned by her relentless need to protect Marcus at all costs. She looked at the federal agents, looked at me, and leaped to the most destructive, joyful conclusion possible. In her twisted mind, her prayers had just been answered. She genuinely believed the FBI had raided my apartment to take down my supposed criminal empire. Vivian threw her hands up into the air, a triumphant, almost hysterical shriek tearing from her throat. "There it is," Vivian screamed, her voice piercing the quiet hum of the server racks. She pointed a vicious, shaking finger straight at my face, looking at Agent Reynolds with an expression of pure, unadulterated victory. "She is the one you are looking for. She is the criminal." I knew it. "I told you she was running a fraudulent operation out of this building. She is the one laundering money and bringing weapons into this city." Vivian took a step toward the heavily armed agents, her chest puffed out with twisted maternal pride as she prepared to sacrifice her daughter to save her family reputation. "Arrest her," she ordered the FBI task force, her voice shrill with glee. "Arrest her right now, sir. Put the handcuffs on her and take her away. We have absolutely nothing to do with her illegal activities. My son is running for city council, and he is a perfectly innocent, upstanding citizen. Take her out of our sight." The absolute silence that followed my mother's hysterical demand was deafening. The only sound in the massive penthouse was the steady mechanical hum of the high-capacity cooling fans, maintaining the temperature of my server racks. Everyone stood completely frozen, waiting for the federal agents to tackle me to the imported marble floor. Vivian had her chest puffed out, her chin raised high, radiating the toxic, misguided pride of a woman who genuinely believed she had just saved her family by throwing her only daughter to the wolves. But Agent Reynolds did not reach for a pair of handcuffs. He did not pull out his badge to intimidate me. Instead, he looked at my mother with an expression of profound, almost pitying exhaustion, as if he were looking at someone completely detached from reality. Then he turned his back entirely on my frantic parents. He walked directly up to me, stopped, and extended his right hand. "Good evening, Maya," Agent Reynolds said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute professional respect that echoed clearly across the room. "The honeypot system you established operated flawlessly. The intruder took the bait exactly as you predicted." Vivian literally choked on her own breath. Desmond took a sudden step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. I reached out and shook the federal agent's hand, feeling the incredibly satisfying weight of total victory. "Thank you, Reynolds," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. Did the data extraction complete before he realized he was trapped in the simulated network? "Every single byte was captured and securely isolated," Reynolds confirmed with a sharp nod. "We have the full digital footprint." My mother could not process this interaction. Her brain completely rejected the undeniable visual evidence right in front of her. She stepped forward again, waving her arms wildly, her designer jewelry clanking noisily. "What are you doing?" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Why are you shaking her hand? She is a criminal. She fixes broken computers in the slums. She is putting my son's political campaign in jeopardy. Do your job and arrest her right now." Agent Reynolds finally turned to look at my mother, his piercing blue eyes narrowing with sharp authority. "Ma'am, I highly advise you to lower your voice and step back immediately. You are currently standing inside the private operational headquarters of our primary independent cybersecurity contractor. This woman is not a criminal. She is the reason we catch them." I turned to face my parents, letting the full crushing reality of my existence wash over them like a tidal wave of ice water. "I do not fix broken laptops, Mother," I said, my voice cold, lethal, and ringing with undeniable power. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of the top digital forensics and cybersecurity firm in the country. When federal banks lose millions of dollars to corporate thieves, they do not call the local police. They call me. I build the security software that protects the entire federal banking system. I track down the white-collar criminals who hide behind custom-tailored suits, fake political campaigns, and generational wealth. I am a fully independent contractor for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and tonight this penthouse is an active federal crime scene." Desmond was paralyzed. His broad chest heaved as his mind short-circuited, completely unable to reconcile the daughter he had treated like an embarrassing burden with the absolute titan of industry standing before him. The patriarchal authority he had clung to his entire life, the false superiority he used to belittle me at every family dinner, dissolved into nothingness. He was standing in a property he could never afford to buy, surrounded by powerful men taking direct orders from his discarded daughter. I slowly shifted my gaze to Chloe. My white old money sister-in-law looked like she had just been struck by a high-speed train. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, translucent shade of gray. She clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest as a shield, but there was absolutely no shielding herself from the sheer magnitude of her own ignorance. Her racist, classist assumptions had just collided head-on with a concrete wall of undeniable black excellence, and the violent impact left her completely breathless. She had spent the entire evening throwing microaggressions at me, treating me like an uneducated charity case who was lucky to even be in her presence. Now she was standing in a room overflowing with federal agents who bowed to my expertise, realizing that my net worth likely dwarfed the trust fund she bragged about so constantly. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Chloe actually shrank back, pressing her shoulders against the nearest wall, her eyes wide with a newfound primal terror. "Thank you so much for the $50 grocery card, Chloe," I said, my tone dripping with a highly polished, merciless grace. It was such a thoughtful, condescending little gesture at dinner. "I know you really enjoyed playing the wealthy savior for the poor, struggling sister-in-law." but I honestly think you should keep it. I reached into the pocket of my dark evening gown, pulled out the plastic gift card she had so arrogantly slid across the restaurant table, and dropped it directly at her feet. It hit the immaculate marble floor with a sharp clatter that made her flinch. You are going to need every single cent on that card to buy ramen noodles for the foreseeable future, I told her, flashing a bright razor-sharp smile. Because the generational wealth you are so incredibly proud of is about to take a massive, irreversible hit. Your perfect lifestyle is officially over. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer panic. Her breathing turned ragged as she looked down at the plastic card, then back up at me. What are you talking about? Chloe demanded, her voice trembling, losing all its previous haughty confidence. My family's money is untouchable. My father is a major investor in the city. You cannot touch us. You do not have the power to ruin my family. I do not need to touch your family's money, Chloe, I replied smoothly, leaning in just slightly. Your husband already did. The entire room to drop 10 degrees in temperature. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chloe whipped her head around, her blonde hair flying across her face to look desperately at Marcus. My golden child brother was currently pressed against the far wall of the command center, right next to the heavy mahogany elevator doors. I was shaking so violently that his knees were practically knocking together, rattling the fabric of his ruined suit trousers. He looked exactly like a cornered animal frantically searching for an exit that simply did not exist. Marcus placed his trembling hands flat against the closed elevator doors, his fingers sliding uselessly against the polished wood. He desperately wanted to run. He wanted to escape the armed federal agents systematically bagging electronic evidence on the conference table. He wanted to escape the horrified, dawning realization on his wife's face. Most of all, he wanted to escape me. But there was nowhere to run. The elevator required my biometric scan to descend. The stairwell doors were blocked by IRS criminal investigators. I was trapped in a glass and steel cage at the very top of the Atlanta skyline, and I held the only key. I turned my back on Chloe and my stunned parents, focusing my full, undivided attention entirely on Marcus. He saw me looking at him and let out a pathetic, stifled whimper, sliding a few inches down the mahogany doors as his legs threatened to give out completely. My father stepped squarely into the middle of the room, throwing his broad shoulders back, as if physical intimidation could somehow override federal law. Desmond had spent his entire adult life ruling our family with an iron fist, demanding absolute submission and weaponizing his position as a respected church elder to crush any dissenting opinions. I was so deeply conditioned to being the ultimate authority figure in every room he entered that his brain completely rejected the reality unfolding before him. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at me, completely ignoring the dozen armed federal agents surrounding us. This has gone far enough. Maya Desmond barked, his deep baritone voice bouncing off the high glass windows of the penthouse. I do not care how much money you have supposedly made, and I do not care what kind of elaborate theatrical prank you have orchestrated here tonight. You are not going to embarrass your brother like this. You are not going to ruin his reputation just because you hold a grudge about the past. I am the head of this family, and I am telling you to call off your little security team right now. Tell these people to leave my son alone, or so help me God, I will have you arrested for harassment. Agent Reynolds instantly tensed. He took a deliberate step forward, his hand resting casually near his utility belt, fully prepared to put my aggressively arrogant father in his place. But I held up my hand, signaling the seasoned federal agent to hold his ground. I did not need the FBI to handle Desmond. I had waited over a decade to handle him myself. You are giving orders in a room where you possess absolutely zero authority. Desmond, I said, keeping my tone deadly calm and utterly devoid of the daughterly submission he was desperately trying to force out of me. You cannot bully reality into changing its shape just because it damages your fragile ego. These men are not actors, this is not a prank, and your golden child is not a victim. I turned away from my seething father and walked deliberately toward the massive glass conference table in the center of the command center. Several forensic analysts stepped aside respectfully to give me room. Lined up on the table were several clear plastic evidence bags, each bearing official government seals and tracking barcodes. I reached down and picked up one specific bag. Inside the thick protective plastic rested a small, sleek silver USB drive. I turned back to face my family, holding the evidence bag up, so the bright fluorescent lights caught the silver metal. Marcus did not come to this building tonight to change the locks on a rental property, I stated, locking my eyes onto my father. He did not come here to protect a family asset. He came here to plug this exact USB drive directly into my private server network. Vivian practically lunged forward, her hands waving frantically in the air as if she could physically bat my words away. "That is a lie," my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Why would a senior portfolio manager at a prestigious investment bank care about your stupid computer servers? He is a financial genius. He handles accounts worth more than you could ever comprehend. He has absolutely no reason to touch anything belonging to you." I let out a slow, humorless laugh that echoed coldly across the server room. I looked at the pathetic, sweating mess of a man cowering against the elevator doors. "Your financial genius is completely bankrupt, Mother," I said, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "He does not handle millions of dollars. He loses them. He has been drowning in secret debt for years, desperately trying to maintain the lavish, wealthy lifestyle that Chloe demands, and that you so proudly brag about at your country club. And when his legitimate salary could no longer cover his massive financial bleeding, he did what he always does. He decided to steal." Desmond shook his head stubbornly, his jaw clenched tight. "You do not know what you are talking about. Marcus is launching a political campaign. He is thoroughly vetted. He is thoroughly desperate." I fired back, my voice rising in volume, demanding absolute attention. "For the past 18 months, Marcus has been systematically siphoning money from his bank's most secure offshore investment fund. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was smarter than the regulatory algorithms. But his bank noticed the discrepancies. They realized someone internal was draining the accounts, and they panicked. They wanted the absolute best digital forensic team in the country to quietly track down the thief before the shareholders found out, and the stock plummeted. So they hired my company." Chloe let out a sharp, choked gasp. She pressed both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes darting toward Marcus in absolute horror, as the pieces of my explanation began to snap together in her mind. I kept my gaze fixed on my mother, refusing to let her look away from the devastating reality of the son she worshipped. "Marcus found out that my firm was leading the audit." I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding, "but he did not know I was the chief executive officer. He only saw my name listed as a network administrator on a preliminary security briefing. And when he saw my name, he did not see a brilliant investigator. He saw a convenient, disposable scapegoat. He saw the same pathetic, helpless failure that you two have always seen." I took a slow step closer to my parents, holding the bagged USB drive right in front of their faces. "I knew the federal authorities would be looking for a digital trail," I explained, breaking down his malicious betrayal so thoroughly that they could never deny it again. "So he wrote a highly malicious piece of malware. He loaded it onto this flash drive and drove to my apartment tonight. His plan was to plug this drive into my home network. The malware was designed to reroute the stolen banking funds directly through my personal IP address, planting false digital receipts all over my servers." The gravity of his actions seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Desmond stared at the small silver drive in my hand, his facial muscles twitching as the denial finally began to fracture. "He wanted the FBI to trace the stolen money directly to my doorstep," I said, my voice dripping with the cold, focused fury. "He wanted heavily armed federal agents to kick down the door of that low-income apartment you thought I still lived in. He wanted them to drag me out in handcuffs. He wanted me to take the fall for a massive federal crime, to be locked away in a federal penitentiary for decades, just so he could walk away clean and continue playing the perfect wealthy politician. I was fully prepared to sacrifice my life and my freedom to save his own skin, because he truly believed that a struggling black woman from the wrong side of the tracks running a financial scam would be the perfect, believable suspect. He weaponized your exact prejudices against me." Vivian stumbled backward. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab onto Desmond's arm just to keep herself standing upright. She looked at Marcus silently, begging him to deny it, begging him to open his mouth and tell me I was making it all up. But Marcus just stood there completely paralyzed, staring at the floor with tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. He had absolutely nothing to say because he knew I had caught him red-handed. I took one final step forward, closing the distance until I was standing inches away from my mother. I looked straight into her terrified, trembling eyes. Your precious son is under investigation for embezzling $25 million from his bank's investment fund, I told her, delivering the ultimate crushing blow with unwavering certainty. He knew my company was hired to audit this case. He sneaked in here to plant malware, change the IP address, and frame me for the embezzlement. He tried to destroy the little sister he considered trash. Marcus practically threw himself away from the heavy mahogany elevator doors, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the polished marble floor. He scrambled on his hands and knees, crawling directly toward our father. He grabbed fistfuls of the tailored fabric of Desmond's trousers, hiding behind the patriarch of our family, like a terrified toddler. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and wild with the panicked desperation of a man completely out of options. "Hi is lying!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed embarrassingly throughout the high-tech command center. "She is lying, Dad. You know she is a hacker. She is a digital manipulator. She manufactured that USB drive to frame me. She has been jealous of me her entire life. She hates that I went to an Ivy League school while she was struggling. She hates that I am running for city council. She hates my success. She orchestrated this entire federal audit just to trap me and steal my reputation. You have to believe me, Mom. You know she is capable of this kind of vindictive sabotage." My mother, Vivian, immediately lunged forward, her maternal instincts violently overriding all logic and visual evidence. She dropped to her knees right beside Marcus, wrapping her arms fiercely around his trembling shoulders, shielding her golden boy from the reality of the room. She glared up at me with a hatred so pure and unadulterated it could have melted steel. "You vindictive, disgusting monster!" Vivian spat, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You engineered this entire nightmare. You knew your brother was launching a historic political campaign next month, and you could not stand the thought of a black man in this family achieving real, undeniable greatness, while you sat alone in a dark room with your computers. You forged that evidence. You probably hacked into his bank and moved those funds yourself just to set him up, Desmond. Call our lawyers right now. We are going to sue her for defamation, and we are going to have these federal agents investigate her for manufacturing false evidence against a public figure." I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I did not step forward to rip Marcus away from her embrace. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression carved from solid ice. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a sleek, matte black remote control. "I think we are entirely done listening to fairy tales tonight," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the hysterical sobbing of my brother. I pressed a single button on the remote. The massive floor-to-ceiling holographic monitors in the center of the penthouse instantly shifted, the cascading lines of financial code vanished. In their place, a crystal-clear, ultra-high-definition video feed flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a stark, cold light. The footage was stamped with a digital time code in the bottom right corner, proving the video had been recorded barely an hour ago. The screen displayed the narrow, dimly lit interior hallway of my decoy apartment in South Atlanta. The hidden camera lens was positioned flawlessly, capturing a wide, unmistakable angle of the front door. Every single person in the penthouse, from the armed federal agents to my trembling father, turned their eyes to the massive screen. In the video, the heavy front door of the apartment clicked open. Marcus slipped inside. The high-definition footage captured every single pathetic detail of his corporate espionage. He was not walking with the confident swagger of a future politician. He was creeping through the hallway like a desperate rat. The microphone feed was so incredibly sensitive that the entire penthouse could hear the sound of his ragged, panicked breathing echoing through the speakers. We watched in absolute silence as the digital version of my brother pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, nervously wiping the sweat from his forehead before slipping a pair of latex gloves onto his shaking hands. He crept into the server room. He reached into his designer suit jacket. He pulled out the exact same silver USB drive that was currently sitting in the plastic evidence bag on my conference table. "That is not him," Vivian whispered frantically, her voice trembling as she stared at the 50-inch projection of her son committing a federal felony. "It is a deep fake. It is artificial intelligence. You altered the video." I did not even look at her. I just kept my eyes locked on the screen waiting for the punchline. On the massive monitor, Marcus stepped up to the blinking server rack. He extended his gloved hand. He pushed the silver USB drive directly into the primary port. The very microsecond the metal connected, the video feed exploded with action. Blinding tactical strobe lights flooded the decoy apartment. The sound of a heavy door being kicked off its hinges roared through the speakers. A dozen armed tactical officers swarmed into the narrow room, their weapons raised, screaming commands that made the audio feed peak and distort. The golden child of our family, the proud, arrogant investment banker who had spent his entire life looking down his nose at me, did not put up a fight. He did not demand to speak to his lawyer. He did not exercise his rights. The tactical lights hit his face. Marcus screamed in sheer terror, dropped straight to his knees, and put his hands on top of his head. He instantly began sobbing, openly bawling, and begging the officers not to shoot him, babbling incoherently about how he did not mean to steal the money and how he could pay it all back. The video feed paused, freezing on a high-resolution, painfully clear image of Marcus kneeling on a cheap carpet, his face twisted in absolute cowardice, tears streaming down his cheeks, a pair of heavy federal handcuffs clamped tightly around his wrists. The silence in the penthouse command center was absolute. The video was undeniable. It was not a deep fake. It was a perfectly executed, legally authorized digital sting operation, and my brother was the star of the show. Desmond stared at the frozen image on the screen, his mouth hanging slightly open, his chest barely moving. The patriarchal illusion he had maintained for 30 years was completely annihilated. "If he was arrested an hour ago," Chloe suddenly spoke up, her voice sharp and trembling from the edge of the room where she had backed away. "If the FBI already had him in handcuffs at the apartment, why is he standing here right now? Why did he come back to the restaurant?" Agent Reynolds stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding against the marble floor. He crossed his arms over his Kevlar vest and looked directly at Chloe, delivering the final crushing blow of the operation. "We released him," Agent Reynolds stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "We removed the handcuffs, told him the tactical team was just a private security firm hired by the building, and we let him walk right out the front door. We wanted him to think he had somehow managed to talk his way out of a trespassing charge. We wanted him to panic." Agent Reynolds turned his piercing gaze toward my father. "When a corporate embezzler realizes his digital frame-up job has failed, he does not go home and go to sleep," the federal agent continued. "He panics. He immediately tries to contact his co-conspirators to warn them that the walls are closing in. We needed your son to walk out of that apartment, grab his cell phone, and make a desperate phone call to his offshore partners. The second he dialed that number in the parking lot, my cyber division intercepted the signal. We traced the call directly to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. By letting him walk free for exactly 60 minutes, your son handed us the final piece of the puzzle we needed to secure federal warrants for his entire financial network." Marcus let out a hollow, agonizing moan. He pressed his face into the marble floor, completely defeated, realizing that his attempt to flee had actually sealed his own fate and handed the federal government the keys to his entire illegal empire. I slowly turned my head, shifting my gaze away from my broken brother and locking my eyes entirely onto my mother. Vivian was still kneeling on the floor, her arms wrapped loosely around the trembling shoulders of her son. But she was no longer looking at him with fierce maternal protection. She was staring up at the massive frozen image of Marcus on the holographic monitor. The high-definition screen illuminated every single line of cowardice, every drop of sweat, every undeniable proof of his profound criminality. I watched the exact second my mother's reality fractured into a million jagged pieces. The glamorous high society picture, perfect illusion, she had spent decades curating for the church congregation, and her elite social clubs evaporated into thin air. She was not the mother of a future city councilman. She was not the matriarch of a flawless, wealthy black family. She was the mother of a disgraced, cowardly federal criminal who was about to be plastered across the front page of every major news outlet in the country. Her golden boy was a fraud, and the daughter she had treated like dirt was the one holding the leash. The massive holographic screen, illuminating the command center, flickered off, plunging the room back into the sterile, cool glow of the server racks. But the devastating image of Marcus kneeling in federal handcuffs remained burned into the retinas of every single person present. For the first time since she stepped out of the elevator, Chloe was not looking at me with disgust. She was not aggressively texting her wealthy family's legal counsel to separate her from my supposed street gang. She was staring directly at the sweating, pathetic mess of a man she had married. The man she believed was her ticket to becoming the First Lady of the Atlanta City Council. The silence stretched thick and suffocating until the sheer magnitude of the situation fully registered in Chloe's aristocratic brain. $25 million in embezzled federal funds. A 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The complete and total annihilation of her pristine social standing. Her survival instinct kicked in with a sudden, violent ferocity. Chloe marched across the marble floor, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone. She stopped right in front of Marcus, who was still cowering on the floor, desperately trying to hide behind my father's legs. She looked down at him, her pale face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You lied to me," Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying rage. "You looked me in the eye and told me you were a financial genius. You told my father you were the smartest portfolio manager in the entire banking sector. You convinced my family to pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into your pathetic political campaign." Marcus slowly raised his head. His face was a complete disaster, slick with sweat and streaked with terrified tears. He reached a trembling hand out toward his wife, desperately seeking a lifeline. "Chloe, please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, sweetheart, you have to listen to me. I was going to put the money back. I just needed to borrow it to cover a few bad investments. I was going to fix everything. My campaign donors were going to cover the margins. I just needed a little more time." He lunged forward, his hands grasping frantically at the hem of her expensive designer coat. "Please, you have to get your father to call his lawyers. His firm can get me out of this. They can make a deal with the prosecutors. Please, Chloe, do not leave me." Chloe did not offer him a comforting embrace. She did not promise to stand by her man through thick and thin. Instead, she raised her hand and delivered a brutal, resounding slap directly across his face. The sharp, violently loud smack of her palm hitting his cheek echoed through the massive penthouse. Marcus gasped, tumbling backward and clutching his face in shock. Vivian let out a strangled shriek, instinctively reaching out to protect her son, but she was too paralyzed by the federal agents surrounding them to actually intervene. "Do not you dare touch me!" Chloe screamed, her perfectly manicured facade completely shattering, revealing the ugly, deeply entrenched racism she had kept carefully concealed beneath her old money politeness. "You lying, deceitful piece of garbage! You are nothing but a common criminal dressed up in an expensive suit. You think my father is going to spend a single dime of our family's generational wealth to save a pathetic, thieving black man who just committed a $25 million federal felony? Are you completely insane?" She took a step back, wiping her hands aggressively against her coat, as if the mere touch of his suit fabric had physically contaminated her. "My family has spent a century building our philanthropic legacy in this city." Chloe continued, her voice rising to a hysterical, venomous pitch. "We sit on the boards of museums. We dine with governors. And you really thought you could use our pristine name to cover up your disgusting ghetto financial crimes? You are going to ruin me. You are going to drag my maiden name into a federal indictment. I will not allow it. I will not let my family be associated with this kind of ghetto behavior." The sheer audacity of her racist outburst hung heavily in the air. For years she had used her marriage to Marcus as a token of her supposed modern progression, parading him around her wealthy white social circles as proof that she was not like her conservative ancestors. But the absolute second her privileged lifestyle was threatened, the very instant the illusion of his flawless black excellence cracked, she reverted instantly to her core prejudices. He was no longer her brilliant, Ivy League-educated husband. He was just another black criminal threatening to drag her down into the dirt. Desmond finally found his voice. His patriarchal pride, already battered and bruised by my undeniable dominance, flared up at the sight of a white woman openly degrading his golden son. "Now see here, Chloe," Desmond barked, stepping slightly in front of Marcus. "You watch your mouth. You are speaking to my son. He is still your husband, and you will not disrespect him in front of these people." Chloe whipped her head around, fixing my father with a glare so filled with contempt it could have frozen boiling water. "Oh, shut up, Desmond," Chloe snapped, completely disregarding decades of forced familial respect. "You are just as delusional as he is. You sat at that dinner table tonight and helped him plot to steal an apartment to suck up to me. You enabled this entire disaster because you wanted to pretend you were part of my world. You are all a bunch of pathetic social climbing frauds." She did not wait for my father to respond. Chloe frantically dug into her designer handbag, pulling out her smartphone with trembling manicured fingers. She completely ignored the armed federal agents, completely ignored my mother's hysterical sobbing, and completely ignored me. She dialed a number, pressing the phone aggressively to her ear. "Dad," Chloe practically screamed the second the call connected. "Dad, listen to me right now. You need to call the senior partners at the firm immediately. Wake them up if you have to. I need an expedited divorce filing drafted by tomorrow morning, and I need an airtight legal firewall built between me and Marcus." She began pacing rapidly near the elevator doors, her voice echoing with sheer self-serving panic. "Hi is going to prison, Dad. He embezzled $25 million from the federal bank. The FBI is literally in the room with me right now. Yes, I am completely serious. No, I am not involved. He hid everything from me. I need you to completely drain our joint accounts before the feds freeze his assets, and I need a public relations firm on standby to distance our family name from this entire disaster." Marcus watched his wife systematically destroy their marriage and completely drain his remaining financial resources right in front of him. He reached out a trembling hand toward her, tears streaming down his face, a pathetic broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to ruin my life just hours earlier. "Chloe, please," Marcus begged, his voice a ragged whisper. "I did this for us. I did this to give you the life you wanted." Chloe paused her frantic pacing. She slowly lowered the phone from her ear, turning to look at the man she had sworn to love through better or worse. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy. She looked at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a corporate raider cutting their losses on a toxic investment. "You did this because you are a weak, incompetent fraud," Marcus, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm. "And you are going to rot in a federal cell for the next 20 years, while I move on with my life." She reached up with her free hand, her fingers gripping the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring Marcus had purchased years ago, a ring he likely bought using stolen funds to impress her demanding family. She aggressively yanked the diamond off her finger, followed immediately by her platinum wedding band. She did not hand the rings back to him. She did not place them gently on a table. She cocked her arm back and violently hurled both rings directly at his face. The heavy diamond struck Marcus squarely in the forehead with a sharp, painful thud before bouncing off his nose and clattering across the marble floor. He flinched, raising his hands to his face, but he was too slow. Chloe did not look back. She did not say goodbye to my parents. She marched directly up to the private elevator doors and aggressively slammed her hand against the call button. When the doors slid open, she stepped inside, frantically tapping the lobby button to escape the collapsing ruins of our family. As the mahogany doors slid shut, sealing her inside, she offered one final devastating parting gift. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and reluctant, undeniable respect. "You win," Maya, Chloe whispered, just as the doors sealed her fate. The elevator descended, plunging the penthouse back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus was left kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the discarded diamond ring resting near his expensive leather shoes. His wealthy white wife had completely abandoned him. His political career was dead. His freedom was officially over. The golden child had finally plummeted from his pedestal, and the impact had shattered him into a million irredeemable pieces. The sharp ping of the elevator arriving back at the penthouse level echoed through the command center, but Chloe was gone. The polished mahogany doors remained securely sealed, leaving an agonizing absolute stillness in her wake. My father Desmond and my mother Vivian stood utterly immobilized in the center of the massive room. They watched the spot where their wealthy old money daughter-in-law had just vaporized, taking with her the pristine social pedigree and the massive political donations they had worshipped for years. Their perfect curated world had not just cracked. It had been systematically dismantled and incinerated in front of a dozen federal agents. Vivian was the first to physically collapse. Her knees gave out, sending her dropping to the imported marble floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. She did not reach out to comfort Marcus, who was still weeping softly near the elevator bank. Instead, her hands clawed at the expensive fabric of her designer evening gown. Her breathing turned ragged, desperate. Desmond, the proud, imposing patriarch of our family, the man who had demanded total submission from me for 3 decades, suddenly looked incredibly small. His broad shoulders caved inward. He slowly lowered himself to the floor beside his wife. I stood perfectly still, watching them kneel. For a split second, a tiny buried fragment of the daughter I used to be actually wondered if this was the moment they would finally apologize. If seeing the undeniable proof of Marcus's depravity and my undeniable success would finally shatter their delusions. I wondered if they were kneeling to beg for my forgiveness for tossing me out, for sabotaging my education, for treating me like the dirt beneath their feet. But I had underestimated the absolute depths of their toxic, manipulative narcissism. They were not kneeling to apologize to me. They were kneeling to ask me to save the monster who had just tried to destroy my life. Maya. Desmond choked out his voice, cracking entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. Maya, please. You have to stop this. You have to tell these agents to leave. I looked down at my father, my face an impenetrable mask of ice. Tell them to leave, I asked quietly. You control the servers, Vivian sobbed, crawling forward a few inches on her knees, her hands reaching out in a pathetic, desperate plea. You are the chief executive. You built the security system. You can just log in and delete the data. Erase the logs, Maya. Wipe the footage. Tell the FBI it was a false alarm. Tell them it was a glitch in the system. You have the power to make all of this go away right now. I stared at the woman who had birthed me, completely mesmerized by the sheer breathtaking audacity of her request. You want me to delete federal evidence, I stated, ensuring the surrounding FBI agents heard every single word of her unhinged proposal. You want me to commit obstruction of justice, tamper with an active federal investigation, and risk my entire corporate empire to cover up a $25 million embezzlement scheme. Desmond surged forward, his face contorting into a mask of desperate manipulative panic. He did not appeal to logic. He did not appeal to the law. He resorted to the absolute lowest, most hypocritical form of emotional blackmail he could possibly conjure. He leaned heavily on his hands, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. Maya, you are a black woman in America, Desmond bellowed, his voice vibrating with a desperate manufactured passion. You know exactly how this country works. You know exactly how the justice system treats black men. They will lock him in a cage for 20 years and throw away the key. They will destroy him. He is your own flesh and blood. You are going to hand your own brother over to the federal government. You are going to let them strip away his dignity and ruin his life. Think about our community. Think about our legacy. You cannot do this to a black man. The silence that fell over the penthouse was absolute. The federal agents surrounding us remained perfectly still, professionals, refusing to intervene in the profound destruction of my family dynamic. I felt a cold, focused energy surge through my veins. The sheer hypocrisy of his statement was so staggering, so profoundly offensive, that it burned away the last lingering traces of familial obligation I held in my heart. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to my kneeling father. I looked down at him, my dark eyes boring directly into his terrified soul. Do not you dare weaponize my blackness to protect a criminal, I whispered, my voice dripping with a lethal, absolute fury. Do not you dare invoke the struggles of our community to cover up the greed of a man who is stealing millions of dollars to buy designer suits and luxury vacations. I leaned in closer, forcing him to meet my gaze. Where was this passionate defense of black lives an hour ago? Desmond, I demanded, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. Where was your outrage about the justice system when Marcus was plotting to plant that USB drive on my servers? when he was actively trying to frame me, a struggling black woman from South Atlanta, for his massive federal crimes? Did you worry about how the system would treat me? When he planned to have heavily armed agents kick down my door, drag me out in handcuffs, and lock me away for decades to save his own miserable skin? Where was your patriarchal protection then? Desmond opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips trembled, his eyes darting frantically away from the crushing, undeniable truth of my words. You did not care about the justice system destroying a black life when you thought that life was mine. I continued, ensuring every single syllable hit like a physical blow. You were perfectly fine with me rotting in a federal prison cell if it meant your golden boy could keep playing politician. You did not care about the system until the system finally caught the real criminal. So do not kneel on my marble floor and preach to me about protecting our legacy. You and Marcus are the ones who destroyed it. Vivian let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands as the final desperate manipulation tactic completely disintegrated. Desmond slumped forward, his head bowing in total, absolute defeat. They had fired their last weapon, and it had completely shattered against the impenetrable armor of my success. I slowly stood up straight, adjusting the lapel of my blazer. I looked away from my broken parents and turned my attention to the man standing quietly near the conference table. Agent Reynolds, I said, my voice returning to the crisp, professional tone of a chief executive officer. I believe we have concluded the necessary digital extraction. The network has been secured and the chain of custody for the physical evidence has been fully documented. Do your agents require anything else from my team tonight? Agent Reynolds stepped forward, a look of profound respect etched into his seasoned features. No, Maya. The honeypot trap was flawless. We have everything we need to proceed with the federal indictments. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch tomorrow morning to formalize the closing reports. Thank you for your continued partnership. I gave him a single sharp nod. You are very welcome. Reynolds turned toward the elevator bank. He signaled to two heavily built tactical agents standing near the entrance. The agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Marcus by his trembling arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. Marcus did not fight them. He hung limp between the two officers, his expensive suit wrinkled and ruined, a pathetic broken shell of the man who had swaggered into my birthday dinner just hours earlier. The tactical agents marched Marcus directly toward the private elevator. As they dragged him past me, he slowly lifted his head. His bloodshot eyes met mine for one brief, agonizing second. He looked exactly like a man staring through the bars of a prison cell he had built with his own two hands. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for forgiveness, perhaps to hurl one last insult. But the heavy mahogany doors of the private elevator slid open, and the federal agents shoved him inside before he could utter a single word. The doors snapped shut, sealing his fate behind a wall of polished wood. The golden child of the family was officially gone. I slowly turned back to face the center of the penthouse. The remaining federal agents were methodically packing up their forensic equipment, securing the evidence bags, and preparing to exit the premises. Desmond and Vivian were still kneeling on the marble floor. They had not moved. They had not spoken. They were completely paralyzed by the utter devastation of their carefully curated, profoundly toxic world. They had lost their wealthy, old-money daughter-in-law. They had lost their political prodigy of a son to a federal penitentiary. They had lost their pristine reputation in the community. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worthless. They looked incredibly small, incredibly pathetic, and completely alone. Get up, I ordered, my voice stripping away the last remnants of familial connection. Desmond slowly raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and empty. Vivian clutched her expensive designer handbag against her chest, her hands shaking violently. They slowly, painfully climbed to their feet, leaning heavily on each other for support. My father looked around the massive, hyper-modern command center. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the glittering Atlanta skyline, stretching out beneath us. The reality of my wealth, my power, and my absolute independence finally undeniably crushed the last of his patriarchal delusions. Maya, Desmond whispered, his voice cracking into a dry, broken rasp. What are you going to do now? I looked at him, feeling a sudden, incredible wave of pure, unadulterated freedom wash over me. The heavy, suffocating chains of their expectations, their prejudices, and their constant manipulation shattered, completely falling away, to leave me entirely untethered. I reached into the pocket of my blazer, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of the black titanium credit card. "I am going to do exactly what you demanded at dinner, Desmond," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "I am going to pay the bill, but I think you and Vivian are the ones who are really going to feel the cost." I signaled to the lead security contractor standing near the entrance of the penthouse. "Escort these two individuals out of my building," I commanded smoothly, "and ensure their names are permanently added to the Sovereign's restricted access list. They are no longer welcome on the premises." My parents did not argue. They did not scream or beg. They simply turned and walked toward the exit, their heads bowed, their empire of lies completely reduced to ashes. I stood in the center of the command center, listening to the soft hum of the servers, watching the elevator doors close on the toxic remnants of my past. The honeypot had worked perfectly. The trap was sprung, the predators were caught, and I was finally truly free. Marcus stared at the spot where his wife had just vanished, his mind completely fracturing under the immense weight of his new reality. The realization that he had absolutely nothing left finally pierced through his cowardly panic. His wealthy wife had abandoned him immediately, severing her family's massive fortune from his criminal disaster. His father, the man who had bullied our entire community into submission for decades, was completely powerless against the federal authorities standing in my living room. His mother's hysterical sobbing was nothing more than useless background noise. The only person holding all the cards, the only person who had outsmarted his entire fraudulent existence, was the little sister he had spent his entire life treating like absolute garbage. The sheer suffocating truth of his own pathetic failure finally snapped whatever was left of his sanity. The terrified, weeping coward kneeling on the marble floor violently morphed into a cornered, enraged predator. It was the desperate, toxic entitlement of a golden child who had never been told no, finally colliding at full speed with an impenetrable wall he could not manipulate or buy his way out of. "You did this to me," Marcus screamed, his voice tearing raw and ugly from his throat. He scrambled up from the floor, his expensive leather shoes sliding frantically against the polished stone as he fought for traction. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged directly at me, his hands outstretched like claws aiming straight for my throat. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to physically punish me for daring to hold up a mirror to his own disastrous criminal incompetence. I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still, radiating a cold, absolute authority, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Before Marcus could cross even half the distance between us, the federal authorities reacted with terrifying, overwhelming speed. Two heavily armored tactical agents, men who spent their careers taking down violent offenders, intercepted my brother mid-lunge. They slammed into him with the sheer, unstoppable force of a freight train. The physical impact echoed sharply through the vast penthouse, a brutal collision of tactical gear against a custom-tailored designer suit. Marcus was violently thrown off his feet. He crashed face first onto the imported marble floor with a sickening heavy thud. The breath was knocked out of his lungs in a sharp, painful gasp, leaving him instantly incapacitated. The federal agents did not give him a fraction of a second to recover. They operated with ruthless, practiced efficiency. One agent pressed his heavy tactical boot firmly between the shoulder blades of my brother, pinning him flat and helpless against the cold stone. The second agent grabbed his wrist, twisting his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of solid steel handcuffs locking tightly into place rang out through the server room. It was the loudest, most definitive sound of the entire evening. It was the absolute, unmistakable sound of a privileged, arrogant man officially losing his freedom. "Stop resisting," the federal agent barked, pressing his knee harder into my brother's spine to ensure total submission. Marcus thrashed weakly against the floor, spitting out curses and crying simultaneously. He looked utterly pathetic. The pristine investment banker, the future city councilman, the flawless pride and joy of my parents, was now writhing on the ground like a trapped rat. He was entirely stripped of his unearned dignity, reduced to nothing more than a common federal inmate. I took a slow, deliberate step forward until the toes of my designer heels were mere inches from his face. I looked down at the man who had stolen my future to feed his reckless addiction, the man who had actively tried to frame me for his own massive corporate crimes just an hour ago. "Look at me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that demanded his absolute attention. Marcus managed to turn his head, pressing his bruised, sweating cheek against the cold marble just to look up at me. His eyes were wide with a pathetic mixture of terror and lingering impotent fury. He was completely at my mercy, and I had exactly zero mercy left to give. $100,000, I said, making sure every single syllable landed with devastating surgical precision. That was the exact amount of my grandmother's tuition money that you blew at illegal casino tables while you were pretending to be a brilliant Ivy League scholar. You took my education. You took my safety. You took the only financial security I had ever known, and you threw it all away on a gambling addiction that our parents desperately covered up. I knelt down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, letting him see the cold, unyielding empire I had built behind my eyes. I used the last 10 years of my life to turn that profound humiliation into a massive cybersecurity empire. I told him, my words slicing through his fragile ego like a scalpel. I slept on dirty floors. I worked 3 grueling jobs, and I taught myself how to build an impenetrable fortress out of code. I took the absolute worst betrayal a brother could possibly commit, and I transformed it into an untouchable legacy. But you had absolutely everything handed to you on a silver platter. You had our parents completely drain their own souls and empty their bank accounts to protect your fragile image. And what did you do with all that blind, toxic favoritism? You used it to buy yourself a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Marcus let out a ragged, choking sob. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face back to the floor, finally unable to look at the undeniable proof of his own pathetic failure. "You are nothing," I whispered, delivering the final, fatal verbal strike. "You are just a common thief in a tailored suit, and you are exactly where you belong." I stood back up, smoothing the fabric of my blazer. I looked at Agent Reynolds, who had been watching the exchange with silent approval, and I gave him a single definitive nod. "Get him out of my sight," I said. The tactical officers gripped my brother by his upper arms and hoisted him roughly up from the floor. They dragged him toward the heavy mahogany doors of the private elevator. His legs were practically useless, his expensive leather shoes dragging pathetically across the pristine floor. He did not try to fight them anymore. The reality of his situation had finally crushed his spirit entirely. The sight of her precious golden son being physically hauled away in federal handcuffs finally broke my mother out of her paralyzed state of shock. Vivian let out a sound that did not even sound human. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek of pure maternal desperation, the sound of a woman watching her entire false reality burn to the ground. She scrambled up from the floor, completely forgetting her expensive silk evening gown and her carefully curated high society image. "No!" Vivian screamed, sprinting frantically across the penthouse. "You cannot take him. He is a good boy. He made a mistake. Please stop. You have to let him go." She threw herself toward the tactical officers, her hands reaching out wildly, desperately trying to grab onto the sleeves of their dark federal windbreakers. She clawed at the durable fabric, sobbing uncontrollably, completely losing any shred of dignity or grace she had left. She was willing to fight armed government agents with her bare hands if it meant saving the illusion of her perfect family. One of the federal agents firmly but respectfully extended his arm, blocking her path and pushing her backward to maintain a safe perimeter around the prisoner. "Step back immediately, ma'am," the agent warned, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "Do not interfere with an active federal arrest." "Hi is my son," Vivian wailed, tears streaming down her face in thick dark rivers, completely ruining her flawless makeup. "He is running for city council. Hi is a prominent man in this community. You are destroying his entire life over a misunderstanding. Please, I am begging you." Desmond remained completely frozen in the center of the room. The imposing patriarch who had always ruled our family and our church congregation through fear and intimidation was now entirely mute. He watched his wife begging armed officers, and he watched his golden son being dragged away like a common street criminal, and he did absolutely nothing. His authority had been completely eradicated. He was a broken, empty man standing in a world he no longer understood. The mahogany doors of the elevator slid open with a soft chime. The agents shoved Marcus inside the mirrored cab. He did not look back at his mother. He did not look at his father. He simply stared blankly at the floor of the elevator, utterly defeated. His shoulders slumped in total surrender. Vivian slammed her hands against the chest of the federal agent blocking her path, weeping and begging for a mercy that was never going to come. The agent gently but firmly shoved her back again, causing her to stumble backward. She lost her balance on her high heels and fell hard onto the marble floor, her silk dress pooling around her. The heavy wooden doors of the elevator began to slide closed. The very last thing my mother saw before the doors sealed shut was the cold silver glint of the federal handcuffs locked tightly around her son's wrists. The doors snapped shut with a heavy final thud, locking Marcus inside and sending him down to the waiting police transport vehicles in the lobby. Vivian let out one final devastating cry of sheer agony, collapsing entirely against the cold floor of my penthouse. The sound of her weeping echoed loudly through the massive room, a pathetic, haunting soundtrack to the absolute and final collapse of her false empire. The heavy silence of the penthouse pressed down on us. The remaining federal agents quietly packed away their gear and slipped out through the service elevator, leaving me entirely alone with the two people who had made my life a living hell. Vivian was still crumpled on the imported marble floor, her weeping having devolved into dry, gasping sobs. Desmond stood over her, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the closed mahogany doors, where his golden child had just been taken away in federal handcuffs. He turned to face me. He straightened his ruined posture, desperately trying to summon the booming patriarchal authority he wielded so effortlessly at his church meetings. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes burning with a futile, desperate rage. "You are no longer my daughter," Desmond declared, his voice echoing coldly off the high glass windows. "You are dead to us. I am officially disowning you from this family. You orchestrated the destruction of your own brother. You humiliated your mother. You have disgraced my name in front of the federal government. Do not ever attempt to contact us again." I stood perfectly still. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I did not feel an ounce of the rejection he so desperately wanted to inflict. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked gracefully over to the sleek glass conference table. I picked up a thick manila folder that had been resting beneath my tablet. "Disown me," I repeated, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. "That is a very bold threat coming from a man who no longer has a kingdom to rule." Desmond frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in utter confusion. "What are you talking about?" he barked. "I am talking about your pristine $1 million estate in the suburbs," I replied smoothly. "The house you love to show off to your church congregation. The house where you hosted all those lavish dinners to impress Chloe and her wealthy relatives. Did Marcus ever mention what he did with the deed to that property?" Vivian stopped sobbing. She slowly raised her head from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting with a brand new kind of terror. "What did he do?" Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of highly sensitive financial documents, dropping them right onto the edge of the table. To cover up his initial embezzlement before the deficit grew into the tens of millions, your brilliant financial genius of a son needed immediate liquid cash. So he used the power of attorney you so proudly handed over to him last year. He secretly took out a massive, unregulated secondary mortgage on your house. Drained all the equity you spent 30 years building, and he dumped it straight into a black hole of offshore debt. Desmond took a staggering step backward. His hands flew to his chest as if he had just been physically struck. "No," Desmond gasped. "The bank would have notified us." "The bank just figured it out during the exact same audit I led," I corrected him sharply. "Because the fraudulent loan is directly tied to his federal crimes, the property has been seized as part of the asset forfeiture. The bank finalized the paperwork this afternoon. The foreclosure is absolute and immediate. The local sheriff will be at your front door tomorrow morning to change the locks and throw all of your precious designer furniture onto the front lawn." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the glass table, watching the last remaining pillars of their arrogant world collapse into dust. But please do not worry, I said, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated sarcasm. I am sure you will not be homeless for long. You can just go stay at the sprawling luxury estate owned by your prestigious wealthy daughter-in-law. Oh, wait. I paused, looking down at them with absolute merciless victory. She just threw her wedding ring at your son and ordered her father to file for an expedited divorce. I guess you are completely out of options. Desmond fell to his knees right beside his wife. The proud, unyielding patriarch was completely hollowed out. They had nothing left. Their golden child was headed to a federal penitentiary. Their generational wealth was entirely wiped out. Their pristine reputation at the church was about to become the biggest scandal in Atlanta history. And the wealthy white in-laws they had sacrificed my future to impress had discarded them like absolute garbage. They were completely and utterly ruined. I looked down at the two broken figures kneeling on my marble floor and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no pity, and no lingering sense of obligation. I turned away from them and walked over to the sleek digital intercom panel mounted on the wall near the private elevator. I pressed a single silver button. The voice of the head of building security responded instantly, crisp and professional. I gave the order clearly and without a shred of hesitation. "Send an escort team up to the penthouse immediately," I commanded. "Escort these two guests out of my building and add their names and faces to the permanent restricted list. From now on, they are banned from ever crossing the lobby doors." Desmond and Vivian did not attempt to argue. When the security team arrived moments later, my parents allowed themselves to be led away like ghosts. They shuffled into the elevator, stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their golden son. The heavy mahogany doors slid shut with a final definitive thud, sealing them out of my life forever. The suffocating toxicity that had plagued me for 31 years vanished, replaced by a profound golden silence. I turned away from the empty elevator bay. I walked across the imported marble floor, heading straight for the massive glass doors that opened onto my private wrap-around terrace. I slid the heavy glass open and stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air. The city sprawled out beneath me, a glittering, vibrant ocean of neon lights, endless traffic, and boundless possibilities. I walked over to a sleek outdoor table and picked up the bottle of complimentary vintage champagne the restaurant manager had sent up earlier. I poured the pale golden liquid into a crystal flute, watching the delicate bubbles rise to the top. I carried the glass to the very edge of the terrace, resting my free hand against the thick glass railing. The brilliant city lights reflected brightly in my eyes. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the family disappointment. I was the architect of my own destiny, holding absolute unyielding power over my own life and my own empire. I looked directly forward, speaking not just to the quiet night air, but to the universe that had finally delivered justice. Some traps are set with complex lines of digital code. I said, my voice steady, confident, and ringing with absolute truth. And some traps are built entirely out of pure, unadulterated greed. My brother chose to step into both. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you. Family is not the people who demand to change your locks in the middle of the night just to throw you out on the street to protect their own fragile egos. Family is supposed to be the place where you are protected. Family is where you feel safe. I raised my crystal glass, offering a toast to the glittering skyline of the city I had conquered on my own terms. And tonight, this penthouse of mine is very safe. I declared, a genuine triumphant smile spreading across my face. Happy birthday to me. I tapped my glass against the thick glass railing. The sharp, crystal-clear ring echoed sharply into the night air.